Salvete vos. I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute, an institute for the humanities and alternative college and high school here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this broadcast is to move from pagan shadows. This is the November 2025 edition of Christian History and Ideas. And we are going to get off to the races with a fine advertisement. The opening piece, I hardly call it a song, of course, is the asparagus ritual at the beginning of Holy Mass. And a beautiful musical setting it is. I do believe the asparagus is the single only thing I miss from my so-called traditional Catholic days. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece. Maybe the creed as well. Credo in unum Deum. I like that too. Anyway, let me bring up the screen share. And speaking of the Holy Liturgy, we offer it online. I suppose if you can get to New Milford, you're welcome to hop into class for that. But yes, here we go. And on our school's website, we have a liturgy and devotion page. And you can see the times for the divine office this semester, as well as, especially important, the stable link. So you just click on this at the appointed times and join us for Sext and Compline. Typically Compline, sometimes we will replace that with the Office of Readings or Vespers for coming into a feast or departing from a more significant feast. On this page is also liturgical features, such as in this month of November, a focus on the Holy Souls, and some Advent points as well. So it would be grand for you to join us in one capacity or another, or all capacities. Finally, on this beautiful liturgy and devotions page, you can see all sorts of free resources, whether that's information on the Transitus of St. Francis, physical posture in the divine office, historical meditations like how Christ said the first Mass, the Anglican Ordinariate's prayer book, Missal and Breviary combined, their Book of Divine Worship, and so forth and so forth. All sorts of rich material for you on our liturgy and devotions page. All right. So here is our image for this month. It comes, of course, from our article featured, as it always is the case, from the Postil magazine. And the full title of this article by Santiago Monyar Flores is From Pagan Shadows to Trinitarian Light. And we see here in the subscription of this image that we're looking at a depiction of the Last Supper from the Catacomb of Domitilla in Rome. And finally, before we set things up for this very helpful article looking at the true synthesis of the classical pagan world and the Christian revelation, something that's bastardized by the likes of the History Channel, Zeitgeist, Newsweek, and all sorts of popular press. Before we get to all this, we do learn that Santiago Monyar Flores is a consultant, lecturer, and columnist on geopolitics and international political economy. And many articles on the Postil are translated from other languages helpfully, and I should think that that is the case with this gentleman's name. So our title is From Pagan Shadows to Trinitarian Light. And I thought a good place to set off from is William Blake's poem, The Divine Image. Here at ApocatastasIs, poetry is very important. In fact, it forms a pillar of our project, which is our unified humanities curriculum. And just like the breviary covers the book of Psalms over a set time, maybe a week or 2 weeks or a month in the liturgy of the hours, whatever, we also have a certain, shall we say, breviary of poetry that we recite every month of about 250 selections. And one of them is the Divine Image. Incidentally, in the American version of the Liturgy of the Hours, there is an appendix. I'm sure no one uses it, but I use it. And it has a number of very fine pieces of Christian poetry one may use in place of the hymns. And that's actually how I found out about this piece. And I think this sets us up very nicely for the type of synthesis ancient Christianity saw between the classical world and Christian revelation. William Blake begins. To mercy, pity, peace, and love, all pray in their distress, and to these virtues of delight return their thankfulness. For mercy, pity, peace, and love is God our Father dear, and mercy, pity, peace, and love is man his child and care. For mercy has a human heart, pity a human face, and love the human form divine, and peace the human dress. Then every man of every clime that prays in his distress, prays to the human form divine, love, mercy, pity, peace. And all must love the human form in heathen, Turk, or Jew. Where mercy, love, and pity dwell, there God is dwelling too. Thus is the Divine Image by William Blake. So every year, coming up next month in December, every year, we are treated to half-baked ideas. In fact, in this series, even going back to the first episodes when I had a co-host, we would pick away at this idea. And that idea, that false idea, is that Christianity is an amalgam of so-called pagan traditions from the Mediterranean. That is false. That is an Enlightenment idea. That is an Enlightenment talking point. However, there is a true way that one might state that Christianity is pagan. There is a false way that you can see on Zeitgeist, where they'll have parallels of the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus compared to Isis and Horus, and allegedly, this pagan sect ate raisin cakes, and look, the Christians eat bread, so therefore that's obviously copied directly, and so forth. These are nonsensical comparisons, so we might call them word concept fallacies. However, there is a true sense where Christianity embraces the classical world. And I'm going to use that term classical even beyond just the religious dimension uh, to the larger consciousness of the classical pagans, so to speak, ideas of piety, connection to the polis, and so forth. All of this gets brought up in its own way in Mr. Flores's article here. And just in terms of our classes, his insights dovetail very nicely with a lot of my work yesterday and our students' work. As in various times we were looking at Augustine and his City of God and Boethius, and both of these men from the 5th and 6th centuries, respectively, had to deal with this. And you can see in those guys' work, they do not see this inherent tension as maybe modern, very Protestantized Christianities, especially, I should be very clear on this point, especially of the American variety. And when I say Protestantized, I would also include a lot of North American Catholics in certain exaggerations that begin developing in the 16th century and the 17th century. If you're interested, I happen to be in the midst of a two-part series on what's called hedonistic Puritans, on America's Reformation legacies. And so I'm hip deep into a lot of the points this author is bringing up, sometimes on the flip side in the case of the Reformation. Anyway, Mr. Flores begins, "The chronicle of human religiosity discloses itself not so much as a sequence of ruptures, but as a dialectic of continuity and transmutation. What is often portrayed as irruption, the advent of Christianity amidst the pagan cosmos, may be more clearly apprehended as the consummation of a universal quest, wherein antecedent symbols, myths, and rites already harbored the seeds of plenitude. Humanity's religious impulses, in their diversity, manifest a persistent orientation toward the sacred, revealing both the limits and the potentials of finite consciousness in its attempt to grasp the infinite." So, historically understood, Christianity was not this break with the pagan world. It was the fulfillment, just as Christ is indeed the fulfillment of Hebraic prophecy. Christ also brings the so-called pagan peoples to their ultimate final stop. And this was a big area of focus in the early church. Obviously, the early church bishops and church fathers, theologians, and average Christians were aware that there were other spiritual systems in the world, very aware, in fact. You can read Acts 17 for Paul's breakdown of Greek spiritual insights. It is absurd, and the ancient Christians knew this. It is absurd that all of these people would be abandoned by God. And so in modern Christianity, there tends to be this very bipolar, in more ways than one, understanding of revelation and um, natural strivings, or false religions, as you like. That was not the case. That and you can see this in the church fathers. You can assert that the pagan gods are devils, and God is working with these peoples nonetheless. These are not mutually uh, contradictory points. Now, don't give me that Gnostic garbage that oh, therefore God is the devil's their worst. No, 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 no. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that even in the trickery and the falsehood of these spiritual systems, God is still drawing the peoples of the world towards himself. And that's why you can see very evidently, East and West, a refinement of the spiritual systems, however misguided they may be in the particulars. There is clearly a refinement of manners, of the conception of the deities, and so forth. And in the early church, don't take my word for it, in the early church, this was an area of science called the Predicatio Evangelium, the preaching of the gospel, and that referred specifically to the study and the meditation on how God was using the non-Hebraic peoples of the world prior to and into the early Christian period. Jean Denelou, which is about the third time this week I've come across himself, in Myth and Mystery contends that paganism constitutes an innate religiosity, not a puerile error, but a partial pathway towards revelation. Pagan myths and rituals embody authentic hierophanies, manifestations. That wasn't too bad. My Greek is getting better. um, the hierophanies, I'll take it. All right. Manifestations of the sacred, which, though requiring purification, articulate the human longing for transcendence. The endeavor of Christianity lay in assuming, sublimating, and perfecting these impulses. By doing so, it neither abolishes nor trivializes the religious insights of antiquity. Rather, it interrogates and ingratiates and elevates them within a coherent theological vision. So if you read Augustine's City of God, that's why this book is so remarkable, is that Augustine is able to put, we'll say, so-called secular history and divine history into one symphonia, which is one of the reasons you might argue that Augustine is the beginning medieval. He is the first medieval man, arguably, because he has developed this medieval vision that did not exist beforehand, this integration and elevation of the classical within the Christian mythology. In this process, not only are the cosmotheistic institutions of the Hellenistic Roman world assimilated, but so too the evolution of Jewish monolatry, from a tribal deity to the monotheistic universal sole creator. In a third strand, the philosophical meditation of Platonism furnishes categories: eudaimonia, the soul's immortality; henosis, that enable the non-reductive comprehension of Christian revelation. Right, so Mediterranean Christianities, as I've written in this very journal, this very august journal, the Postil, Christianity is a Hebraic skeleton. That is the mythos. That is the morality. That is the scripture of the Hebrews, and the flesh of Mediterranean Christianities, which you might call Catholic and Orthodox in later history. The flesh of this is Hellenistic philosophy, because Hellenistic philosophy allows Christianity, well, to be a serious intellectual system, which is, by the way, why at the time of the Reformation, when you completely go hardcore in, and especially talking about the radical Reformation that becomes American Christianity, so-called, when you strip away all the Hellenism and all the classical, so-called pagan inheritance of Christianity in the 16th century, and you run out the clock and you burn whatever fumes of pre-Reformation authentic Christianity that you have left, that's how you end up with the in my opinion, the nonsense of North American Christianities, which do not appeal to thinking men. And a lot of that has to do with the reductionism and the super simplification and even the juvenilization of Christianity that has happened in the last 500 years because of the stepping away from the Greek hermeneutics and the ability to make categories and nuances, and indeed to incorporate previous cultures. A lot of people in this very, very stripped down so-called Christianity in North America leave. And they leave because they're, in their minds, what's being presented to them as Christianity completely has locked out the spiritual experiences of the rest of the world right now and of most of human history. And this is absurd. And these are some of the ramifications of not having this sublime appreciation of pre-existing traditions. These three currents, each profound in its own right, converge and find their ultimate expression in the Christian synthesis. Thus, Christianity emerges as dialectical plenitude, the synthesis of pagan myth, Jewish monotheism, and Greek philosophy converging in the Trinity. To grasp the genius of this convergence, one must appreciate the crucial theological distinction between the ontological and economic Trinity. The ontological Trinity is God as he is in himself in se, the eternal, immutable mystery of triune life. The economic Trinity is God as he reveals himself ad extra in the economy of creation and redemption. Are we good with that? Once again, the ontological Trinity is God in se, the economic Trinity is God in time, in creation, etc. It is through the latter that we come to know the former. We know God, basic catechism, we know God from his works in history. For the economic Trinity manifests in time the eternal ontological reality. This distinction is made the very mechanism of the Christian synthesis. It allows the partial truths of antiquity to be seen as genuine, the partial truths of the pagan world to be seen as genuine, albeit preparatory, glimpses of the economic Trinity, whose inner foundation is the unchanging reality of the God who is, from eternity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This is why, when you read, for instance, the Divine Comedy, Dante doesn't just have Virgil guide him through 2/3 of the underworld to God, in other words, symbolizing the fact that pagan truths, natural truths ultimately, can bring you to the feet of supernatural mysteries. They can't bring you in there. That's why Beatrice has to take over. But they can bring you to the doorway. That's also why in Canto, I think, 4 of the Inferno, Dante comes across the virtuous pagans in limbo. That would be very difficult for a modern so-called Christian. Both Catholic and Protestant are equally distorted, more times than not, on this point. A modern Christian of whatever sect would have a very hard time writing something like the limbo scene where you have Saladin and Plato and Averroes and Boethius. No, Boethius is in heaven, of course. He's actually, Boethius, I found out yesterday, is a Catholic saint. Although he's not called Saint Boethius, he's called something else. Anyway, Boethius is not in limbo in the book or in real life, but in Dante's book, there are all sorts. And the reason is the classical inheritance is part of Christianity, because the great genius of Christianity was the universal vision of life and ultimately the universal vision of salvation. Modernity, beginning in that Reformation, modernity, and picking up steam in the Enlightenment, pitting mythos against logos, has obscured the primordial character of myth. Listen, you show up for John Coleman, you show up for the asparagus, but you stay for lines like this. And this is why you read the Postil every month, right? Modernity, in pitting mythos against logos, has obscured the primordial character of myth. For Homer and the Hesiod, mythos denoted preeminently a solemn discourse given with divine authority. Myth, in the words of a fragment from the compendium, does not represent, but rather witnesses and presents the very action of the gods. In this vein, myth constitutes a mode of cognition. It's a way of thinking, a bridge between soul and divine, akin to philosophical logos, yet of a distinct order. It is a discourse that moves the human heart and mind toward that which is beyond human articulation, participating in reality rather than merely describing it. Right? Myth helps us participate in reality rather than describing it. And of course, married very closely to myth is ritual and liturgy. Hence, Clement of Alexandria cites Speusippus, Plato's nephew, in defining eudaimonia as, quote unquote, the complete and perfect state, telos, of those things that are endured by nature. The virtues engender felicity, since they redirect men toward his ultimate end, which is none other than the absence of perturbation and orientation toward the divine. Hesiod's myth of excellence corroborates this ascensional dynamism. The path to virtue is arduous, yet it culminates in union with the immortal gods. Paganism, then, is no irrational chaos of cults. That's what modern Christianity, boiled down, stripped of its heritage, stripped of certain. In fact, I mean, part of the stripping of Christianity in the past few hundred years has been the removal of certain texts, which, incidentally, even amongst the Protestants, originally the very Hellenistic texts that are so-called deuterocanonical or so-called apocryphal, those 6 or 7 books like Maccabees and Wisdom and so forth, those are great snapshots of late Hebraic spirituality, both like Maccabees hostile to Hellenism and like Wisdom embracing Hellenism. Both of those books were written at the same time, and they have two very different approaches. But the interesting part is that this very Hellenistic, overall Hellenistic corpus of text, the so-called deuterocanonical or apocryphal books of the Bible, which are shoved out of the collection in the 16th century, I think they would go, because of the nuances of these texts, they would go a certain distance to softening this idea of Christian revelation being in diametric opposition to every possible insight of so-called paganism. So it's not for nothing that you see this corroboration between a Christianity which has removed its own text, its own history, its own liturgy, its own saints, its own monastic culture. It's stripped itself to the bare bones. It's become pure logos. It's become, as the Orthodox Christians in the East are quick and correct to point out, Western Christianity, Catholic or Protestant, becomes just this agreement with propositions. Oh, I believe in Jesus. I believe in the Bible. I believe in it's just the life of faith and the life of theosis and the life of divine grace in the soul completely goes away, and all that the life of the soul, so-called, has left now is just agreeing to theological propositions. You get that type of simplicity, perhaps because you also remove a lot of the Hellenistic material from the Holy Bible at the beginning of this experiment 400, 500 years ago. Anyway, Ramsay MacMullen has demonstrated how, in the Roman Empire, this plurality converged upon the solar cult, Sol Invictus, as a symbol of unity absorbing all theophanies. The same notion is echoed in Alcinous's, oh my goodness, Didaskalikos, not too bad. Assimilation to God demands virtue, discipline, and orientation toward noetic realities. Myth, therefore, served as philosophical preparation, cultivating the mind and heart for truth not yet fully articulated. So, just like the Hebrews have to have progressive revelation in a very special way, even a unique way from God, progressively, myth for the pagans allows them in a more natural progression to move toward truths not yet fully articulated. The myths are not the truths, but they can point in the right direction. These pagan insights find their fulfillment in the economic trinity. The solar symbolism is baptized. It's baptized. That's why you see in certain iconography, I think the Jesuits use it, you have the sun and so forth. It's not because Christianity is paganized in the way that the world and the way that radical Protestants posit, and the way that the Enlightenment posited, but rather in the Christian consciousness of Christ's triumph over death and error and the cross, these things symbolizing evil. Christ triumphs and sublimates these things into ultimate victory. Well, likewise, things like the sun symbol or different so-called pagan holidays, they can be baptized, so to speak. This is not the watering down of Christianity that you hear in certain quadrants, certain sectors. You only get to that clunky, ham-fisted conclusion if you chuck out Hellenistic nuance and, frankly, if you chuck out most of the lived Christian experience. That's what makes you ripe for things like zeitgeist movies, History Channel, revelations of Christ being Osiris and garbage like this. The solar symbolism is baptized. It's not abolished as Christ is proclaimed, quote unquote, the Son of Righteousness in Malachi, which I believe we'll be reading very shortly in the Liturgy of the Hours, revealing the divine light that was always shining through creation, now made fully manifest in history. Whereas paganism sought in divine cosmetic immanence, Israel pursued the contrary course, radical transcendence. Yahweh in his origins was a storm deity bound to a tribal league. Yet, through the prophetic history, especially in 2nd Isaiah, Yahweh reveals himself as the sole universal creator. I am Yahweh, there is no other. This transition constitutes a dialectic akin to the Hesiod's account of excellence. Arduous anguish to replete with ruptures and exiles, yet culminating in monotheistic purity. Myths lead us to reality. They are not the truths themselves, but they lead us to the truths in God's plan, in his good time. Again, this is a theological study called the Predicatio Evangelium. Now, after this setup, there's a long treatment, although not nearly as long as the sidebar would have you believe, because all the books, this always happens every month, all the books that the Postil sells, and good books they are, and all the other articles get lined up in a single column, so it makes the page literally 10 times longer than it needs to be when you blow up the text here. But yeah, there's a long treatment of the Trinity as both the ultimate end of Hebraic revelation and something greatly assisted by Hellenistic philosophy, and to a certain extent, the nuances of myth in the pagan world, that there is a synthesis here, not a synthesis in the Hegelian sense at all. That's not at all what this article, nor myself, is arguing. But the fact that Greek thinking and nuance, which has always been embraced by the Holy Church, allows a sublimity of theology. It also creates protections, as the author Flores here argues. It also creates protections about Christianity becoming paganized. Greek thinking and the categorization and the maturity of this objective way of looking at reality, all of these things we take from the Greeks. This very way of thinking protects Christianity from a danger which might exist otherwise, which is the common pop idea that you hear in different sectors, sacred and profane, of Christianity, becoming paganized in the 4th century or thereabouts, right? So there's a lot of nuances here, and that's the whole point of this series. And hopefully, please God, to indicate that Christianity has a much longer history and is a much broader thing than it is in our sorry day and age and neck of the woods. So I just want to conclude with this final paragraph. I leave it to you to read the full piece. It's not that long. Indeed. Christianity's synthesis, Flores concludes, anchored in the ontological Trinity, that's the Trinity, God in se, and expressed in the economic Trinity, God in time, God in history, demonstrates that divine simplicity and multiplicity, human reason and divine revelation, past preparation and present realization converge in the communion of love that alone satisfies the deepest human longings. In the end, every myth, every philosophical insight, every prophetic word points to the one reality in which all human striving finds completion, the living triune God. So even if it's a pagan myth, even if it's a pagan philosophy, even if it's a pagan so-called prophetic word, where there is an inherent truth in this, it will necessarily point to the Holy Trinity. So there is not, in the way the world points out, and in the way, frankly, that modern so-called Christianity, Catholic and Protestant, and I should think a Western Orthodoxy as well, has bastardized things. There is not this bipolar, um, inimical enemy relationship with the previous pagan world, like we have inherited and we've probably just kind of assumed. But historical Christianity had far more nuanced approach to the previous religious systems, having, on the grounds of Christ's victory over death, having no qualms or compunctions whatsoever of using natural truths and pagan insights and so forth for the gospel message. And once again, you can consult Acts chapter 17, where you can see this very gentle embrace of the classical world as Paul compliments the pagans and the Areopagus on their religiosity. And then he takes it the next step because just like Virgil takes Dante so far, just like the rather nuanced Greek religion can take them right up to the gospel. Well, you do have to cede to divine revelation, to divine grace. So the natural insights can take you so far, right? But then you jump into mystery. You with the help of God's grace, make the next step. But what you don't see in historical Christianity, East or West, is this spitting antagonism towards the pagan world, like we tend to imagine nowadays because of uh, unlettered people, both from the so-called Christian communities and sects, as well as from different Enlightenment partisans and occultists and so forth. So there we go. There we go. From Pagan Shadows to Trinitarian Light by Santiago Mondayar Flores from the November 2025 edition of the Postil magazine. Once again, you are welcome. Once you read every single word on the Postil for this month, you are welcome only then to boogie woogie over to Apocatastasis' website. And this is our front page. We have all sorts of good things. Here's the Reformation part 1, meditation. And then without loading the page, I think down the ways, you can see our Divine Office stuff here too. So we have everything laid out, and you're more than welcome to join us. We are rebuilding society. Every school should be concerned about enriching society. I don't know if they are or not, but we certainly could use your help. And part of that help will be in prayer, and part of that help will be in the classroom. So with that being said, thank you, and enjoy reading this month's article. See you next month.